history remembers him simply as Caesar, a name that embodies towering ambition, brilliant strategy, and a fall that has resonated through 2 millennia. From his position at the pinnacle of power, this military genius commanded the world as conqueror of Gaul, victor in civil war, and dictator of Rome. Revered by some as a necessary reformer, and reviled by others as liberty's destroyer. Born to a noble but unremarkable family, the young Roman rose through a fractured republic, where he witnessed the bloody power struggles of Marius and Sulla. This taught him Rome's essential truth: power belongs to the bold. Applying this lesson, he excelled as an unrivaled commander, brilliant political strategist, and visionary ruler whose reforms outlived him. His extraordinary abilities transformed Rome from republic to empire, permanently altering Western civilization. The saga of Julius Caesar begins with ambition and ends with a knife. To understand the man, we must first understand the soil from which he grew. The Rome of the late Republic was no longer the austere city-state that had defeated Carthage and conquered the Mediterranean. By the 1st century BC, it had become something far more complex and far more volatile. For nearly 4 centuries, the Republic had thrived under a delicate balance of power. At its heart stood the Senate, 300 men of wealth and lineage who guided policy and guarded tradition. They elected consuls to lead Rome for a single year, never consecutively, ensuring that no one man could accumulate too much power. Tribunes of the plebs served as the voice of common citizens, wielding veto power to check senatorial overreach. This was a republic designed to prevent tyranny through carefully distributed authority. But beneath this elegant political machinery lay fracture lines growing deeper with each passing decade. Rome had conquered faster than it could adapt. The wealth of empire flooded into patrician coffers, while ordinary citizens watched their small farms vanish, swallowed by vast estates worked by slaves captured in foreign wars. Veteran soldiers returned home to find themselves landless, their sacrifices forgotten. The divide between patricians and plebeians, the ancient fault line of Roman society, widened into a chasm. Power concentrated in fewer hands. The nobility, once servants of the state, increasingly viewed Rome as their personal inheritance. Their mansions grew more opulent, their banquets more lavish, while the forum echoed with the angry voices of the dispossessed. Into this tension stepped 2 men whose rivalry would forever alter Rome's destiny: Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla, uncle and enemy to the young Gaius Julius. Marius, a new man of humble origins, rose through military brilliance to an unprecedented 7 consulships. Facing manpower shortages during the war against Jugurtha, he made a revolutionary change. No longer would the army consist only of landowners with stake in Rome's future. Now, any citizen could enlist, including the propertyless. They flocked to his standard, seeing in military service a path to land and dignity. But these soldiers now looked to their general for rewards, not to the Republic. Their loyalty shifted from Rome to the man who would secure their future. With this single reform, Marius unwittingly planted the seeds for military strongmen who would eventually topple the Republic. His rival Sulla represented everything Marius was not: aristocratic, conservative, defender of senatorial privilege. When civil war erupted between them, Rome witnessed horrors previously unimaginable. Proscription lists named enemies of the state whose property could be seized, whose lives were forfeit. Neighbor informed on neighbor. Roman blood flowed in Roman streets. Sulla emerged victorious and proclaimed himself dictator. not for the traditional 6-month emergency term, but without time limit. He ruthlessly reshaped the constitution to restore Senate authority, then shocked Rome by voluntarily relinquishing power and retiring to his villa. But the precedent had been set. One man had seized absolute control, rewritten the laws to his liking, and suffered no consequences. The young heir to the Julian name observed these convulsions from the periphery, learning, calculating. If Marius showed how a general could harness the power of the common soldier, Sulla demonstrated how completely the Republic could be bent to a single will. These were not lessons he would forget. By the time the young patrician with the piercing dark eyes began his climb through Roman politics, the Republic was a hollowed shell of constitutional forms, concealing the raw pursuit of power. Corruption had infected every level of governance. Elections were openly bought. Governors plundered provinces to pay campaign debts. The courts served justice only to those who could afford its price. The machinery still functioned, the ceremonies continued, but something essential had been lost. Rome had conquered the world, but could no longer govern itself. It awaited a man who could master its contradictions, who could promise revolution while preserving tradition, who could champion the people while courting the elite, who could appear to restore the Republic while transforming it forever. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and in the wings, watching carefully, stood the man who would become both Rome's greatest champion and its final nemesis. The Julian family, into which the infant Gaius was born on July 13th, 100 BC, claimed descent from Julius, son of Aeneas, who was himself the son of Venus. This divine lineage, however impressive in ancestral ceremonies, brought little practical advantage. Though patrician in status among Rome's oldest nobility, the family's fortunes had declined. They occupied a modest home in the Subura district, a crowded, sometimes dangerous neighborhood far from the grand houses on the Palatine Hill. His father, also named Gaius Julius Caesar, had achieved some political success, reaching the rank of praetor, but never the consulship. He died unexpectedly when his son was just 16, leaving the teenager as head of his household. This early brush with mortality would become a driving force in the young man's ambition. Suetonius would later write of his determination to do something notable and worthy of memory. The dominant influence in his formative years was his mother, Aurelia Cotta. A woman of formidable intelligence and impeccable virtue, she instilled in her son the discipline that would later characterize his military campaigns and the grace that would charm Rome's elite. Under her watchful eye, the young patrician received an education befitting Rome's ruling class, mastering Greek and Latin literature, studying philosophy and rhetoric, training his body for the physical demands of public life. Even in adolescence, his exceptional qualities were apparent. Contemporaries noted his piercing gaze and natural authority. He showed a remarkable memory, a gift that would later allow him to dictate multiple letters simultaneously and recall the names of countless soldiers. The orator Apollonius of Rhodes, after hearing the young Roman's speeches, lamented that through this youth, Greece would lose what remained of her glory. But these peaceful years of education were soon shattered by the violence convulsing Rome. Sulla's march on the city in 82 BC cast a shadow over the young man's future. As nephew to Marius and son-in-law to Cinna, both leaders of the populist faction and enemies of Sulla, the 17-year-old suddenly found himself on the wrong side of a bloody political purge. Sulla demanded he divorce his wife Cornelia, daughter of Cinna. Unlike many others faced with the dictator's wrath, the young Julian refused. It was his first significant political stand, and nearly his last. Stripped of his inheritance and priesthood, he fled Rome with a price on his head, moving nightly to avoid capture. For weeks, he hid in the marshy countryside, suffering from malarial fevers that would periodically plague him throughout his life. His mother's family eventually secured a pardon, with Sulla reportedly warning those who interceded, "Very well, take him. But know this, in this young man I see many Mariuses." Whether apocryphal or not, the words proved prophetic. The dictator had recognized something essential about the youth he spared, an ambition that would not be contained by tradition or law. These years of exile and danger left their mark. While peers enjoyed the privileged path to power, the young Julian learned to survive among common people, fishermen, farmers, soldiers, developing the common touch that would later win him fierce loyalty. He witnessed firsthand the fragility of Roman institutions and the brutal reality of power stripped of constitutional niceties. When Sulla finally stepped down in 78 BC, the young nobleman returned to a Rome forever changed. The Republic still stood in form, but the substance had been altered. Constitutional boundaries had proven permeable. Traditional restraints on ambition had been exposed as mere convention. For a man with the right combination of popular support and military power, anything was possible. The crucible of civil strife had forged his character. From his uncle Marius, he inherited the loyalty of the common people and a vision of Rome that transcended the narrow interests of the nobility. From his adversary, Sulla, he learned the effectiveness of boldness and the transient nature of constitutional barriers. From his mother, he gained the cultural refinement to move easily among the elite, despite his populist leanings. These contradictory elements, patrician birth with popular sympathies, ruthless ambition with genuine vision for Rome's future, personal charm with steely determination, would define his political identity. The years of youthful hardship had created a man uniquely positioned to exploit the Republic's weaknesses while claiming to champion its virtues. As he prepared to begin his own career in Rome's cutthroat political arena, few could have predicted how completely this still obscure young aristocrat would transform the world. But the young man with the aquiline nose and receding hairline harbored no doubts about his destiny. The path ahead might be dangerous, but he would rather, as he later told his soldiers before crossing the Rubicon, be first in a small village in Gaul than second in Rome. Returning to a Rome still reeling from Sulla's purges, the young patrician faced a daunting prospect. His family connections tainted by association with the defeated Marian faction. His inheritance depleted, he possessed only his name, his education, and his extraordinary self-confidence. Rather than wait for rehabilitation in Rome, he chose a soldier's path, joining the staff of the governor of Asia Minor. His first taste of combat came during the siege of Mytilene. Sent to request ships from King Nicomedes of Bithynia, he lingered so long at the royal court that rumors spread of an intimate relationship with the aging monarch, whispers that would follow him throughout his career. When questioned about these allegations, he deflected with his characteristic wit, neither confirming nor denying what his enemies called every woman's husband and every man's wife. Military service soon gave way to a more dangerous adventure. Sailing to Rhodes to study rhetoric under the famed Apollonius Molon, his ship was captured by Cilician pirates near the island of Pharmacusa. Upon hearing they intended to demand 20 talents for his release, he laughed outright and insisted they ask for 50, as he was surely worth more. During his 38 days of captivity, he joined in their games, recited poetry, and wrote speeches, good-naturedly threatening to crucify them all once ransomed. The pirates, charmed by their unusual captive, took these pronouncements as jokes. They learned otherwise. Immediately upon release, he borrowed ships from nearby allies, pursued his former captors, captured them, and, true to his word, had them crucified. Though in a show of mercy, he ordered their throats cut first. This combination of charm, unpredictability, and ruthless follow-through would become his hallmark. When word reached him in 78 BC that Sulla had died, he returned to Rome to begin his political climb in earnest. Rome's political ladder, the cursus honorum, traditionally began with the quaestorship, followed by the aedileship, then praetorship, and culminated in the consulship. A young man on the rise was expected to build support gradually, pay his dues, and wait his turn. Patience, however, was not among his virtues. He established residence on the Subura, Rome's bustling working-class district, rather than the patrician Palatine, an early signal of his populist leanings. Through strategic generosity that often exceeded his means, he built a network of clients and supporters among both common citizens and the elite. Debt became a political tool, binding creditors to his success rather than strangling his ambitions. His opportunity for dramatic public display came at the funeral of his aunt Julia, widow of Marius. Breaking with tradition, he ordered the ancestral masks and insignia of the long ostracized Marius carried in the funeral procession, a direct challenge to Sulla's legacy. The crowds erupted in approval. Shortly afterward, when his young wife Cornelia died, he delivered a funeral oration so moving that the notoriously fickle Roman public spoke of it for years. Elected quaestor in 69 BC, he served in Spain, where he reportedly wept at the sight of a statue of Alexander the Great, lamenting that at the same age Alexander had conquered the world while he had accomplished nothing of note. This burning sense of destiny, delayed, propelled him forward at a pace that alarmed traditionalists. Upon returning to Rome, he married Pompeia, granddaughter of Sulla, a calculated alliance with the conservative faction he had once fled. His tenure as a dial in 65 BC showcased both his extravagance and political acumen. Responsible for public games and buildings, he mounted spectacles of unprecedented scale. 320 pairs of gladiators equipped with silver armor, public banquets for thousands, and magnificent temples and porticos. These displays, financed by massive loans, brought public adoration at the expense of financial stability. When criticized for his mounting debts, he reportedly claimed to need 25 million denarii, simply to be worth nothing. Behind the spectacle lay shrewd calculation. Each act of public generosity expanded his base of support. Every debt to a wealthy backer made that man invested in his rise to positions where those debts could be repaid through provincial appointments. His financial recklessness was, paradoxically, a form of political security. When the conspiracy of Catiline erupted in 63 BC, threatening to upend the Republic through armed insurrection, he displayed the political agility that would repeatedly save him from disaster. While the stern traditionalist Cato advocated executing the captured conspirators without trial, he argued for life imprisonment, positioning himself as both defender of order and merciful populist. Though he failed to prevent the executions, he emerged with his reputation intact, while others bore the political costs. Elected Pontifex Maximus, Rome's highest religious office, the same year, he secured the position through lavish bribes, despite his relative youth and questionable piety. The appointment provided both prestige and a home in the official residence in the Forum, placing him literally at the center of Roman public life. When appointed governor of further Spain in 61 BC, he left Rome so hastily to escape creditors that his political mentor Crassus had to guarantee his debts of some 20 million sesterces. In Spain, he found both military glory and financial salvation. Leading campaigns against Lusitanian hill tribes, he secured enough plunder to pay his debts while earning his first military triumph. More importantly, he gained first-hand command experience and the loyalty of troops who came to admire his courage, endurance, and willingness to share their hardships. The man who had once spent his days in the company of poets and rhetoricians discovered that he possessed a natural genius for warfare. Returning to Rome in 60 BC, he faced a crucial decision. Custom dictated that a returning general disband his army before entering the city if he wished to campaign for the consulship. To celebrate a triumph, however, required remaining with his troops outside the Pomerium, Rome's sacred boundary. No man had ever been permitted to stand for consul in absentia. The Senate, increasingly wary of his ambitions, refused to grant an exception. The choice was stark: military glory or political advancement. For a man with his goals, there was no question. He disbanded his troops, forfeited his triumph, and entered Rome to campaign for the highest office in the Republic. The coming year would transform both his fortunes and Rome's destiny. To secure the consulship, he would forge an alliance that would shake the foundations of the Republic, an alliance with the one man whose military glory eclipsed even his own. By 60 BC, Rome's political landscape was dominated by three men whose ambitions exceeded the Republic's capacity to contain them. Each possessed what the others lacked. Each needed the others to overcome the Senate's resistance to his goals. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, stood as Rome's most celebrated general. Returning from the east after extraordinary campaigns that had doubled Rome's territories and treasury, he had disbanded his legions in a show of constitutional propriety. Now he found himself frustrated by senatorial obstruction. The conservative faction, led by Marcus Porcius Cato, refused to ratify his eastern settlements or provide land for his veterans. His military glory, unprecedented since the days of Scipio Africanus, counted for nothing in the Senate chamber. Marcus Licinius Crassus possessed what Pompey lacked: immense wealth and a network of clients and debtors that spanned the entire aristocracy. After suppressing Spartacus's slave rebellion, he had accumulated a fortune estimated at 200 million sesterces through property speculation, silver mines, and money lending. Yet despite his riches, the consulship had eluded him, and his rivalry with Pompey had stymied his political ambitions. The third figure, younger, more dynamic, more deeply in debt, but possessed of unparalleled political instinct, saw opportunity in this impasse. While Pompey and Crassus remained bitter rivals, he had maintained good relations with both. Pompey had married his daughter Julia. Crassus had repeatedly rescued him from financial ruin. Now he proposed an alliance that would circumvent senatorial opposition through their combined influence. This informal coalition, known to history as the First Triumvirate, was less a partnership of equals than a temporary alignment of interests. Pompey needed his eastern settlements ratified. Crassus sought lucrative tax farming contracts for his equestrian allies, and the youngest member required the consulship and a provincial command that would provide military glory and financial opportunity. The Senate, recognizing the threat this alliance posed to their authority, attempted to neutralize the rising star by assigning as his consular province the woods and pastures of Italy. A humiliating posting with no opportunity for conquest or enrichment. This miscalculation only strengthened the triumvir's resolve. The election proved contentious, but ultimately successful. Through a combination of lavish bribery and intimidation, with Pompey's veterans visibly present in the forum, he secured the consulship for 59 BC. His conservative colleague, Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, provided little check on his actions. When Bibulus attempted to obstruct legislation by declaring unfavorable omens, he was physically assaulted in the forum, doused with excrement, and forced to retreat to his home for the remainder of the year, leading wits to date documents in the consulship of Julius and Caesar. His year as consul demonstrated both his ruthlessness and his genuine concern for Rome's structural problems. He pushed through an agrarian law redistributing public land to Pompey's veterans and the urban poor, established colonies to relieve urban overcrowding, ratified Pompey's eastern settlements, and secured favorable tax contracts for Crassus's allies. When legal opposition failed, he simply ignored it. Legislation was rammed through the popular assemblies without senatorial approval. Constitutional objections were met with force. The historian Dio Cassius observed that he administered all the affairs of Rome as if it were a conquered city. Yet amid this constitutional strong-arming lay genuine reform. His Julian laws addressed long-festering issues of corruption, debt, and land distribution. His reorganization of tax collection in Asia reduced exploitation of provincial subjects. His publication of the Senate's proceedings, the Acta Diurna posted daily in the forum, increased transparency in government. These measures earned him the gratitude of ordinary citizens and the hatred of the senatorial class, deepening the polarization of Roman politics. To cement their alliance, strategic marriages were arranged. Pompey, recently widowed, married Julia, his colleague's daughter, creating a family bond between former rivals. The Triumvirate himself married Calpurnia, daughter of the influential Lucius Calpurnius Piso, who would succeed him as consul and protect his interests. Most crucially for his own ambitions, he secured through legislative action a 5-year governorship of Cisalpine Gaul, northern Italy, and Illyricum, the eastern Adriatic coast. When the governor of Transalpine Gaul, southern France, died unexpectedly, he added this province to his command, giving him authority over 3 provinces and 4 legions. This appointment offered everything he required: distance from Rome's increasingly hostile political environment, opportunity for military conquest, and crucially, immunity from prosecution for his controversial consulship. The moment his term ended, his enemies would drag him into court. In the provinces, however, he would be untouchable as long as he retained his imperium, his legal right of command. For Pompey and Crassus, this provincial posting seemed an elegant solution. Their troublesome young ally would depart Rome, leaving them to consolidate power in the capital. They failed to recognize that in Gaul he would find the one thing that could truly threaten their supremacy: a loyal, battle-hardened army devoted to its general rather than the distant republic. As his consular year ended, he departed Rome amid senatorial recriminations and popular acclaim. The republic had survived Marius and Sulla. It had weathered the conspiracy of Catiline. Now it faced a subtler threat, a man who subverted its institutions while claiming to defend them, who broke its laws while writing new ones, who courted the masses while dining with the elite. The alliance he had forged seemed inherently unstable. 3 ambitious men temporarily subordinating their rivalries to overcome senatorial resistance. Few expected it to endure. Fewer still recognized that of the 3 partners, the youngest and seemingly least powerful would emerge as master of Rome, an architect of its transformation. As the new proconsul crossed the Alps toward his Gallic provinces in early 58 BC, he left behind a Rome divided between his supporters and detractors. Both would soon be forced to reassess him in light of approaching events that would reshape the map of Europe and forever change Rome's understanding of its northern frontiers. The territory known to Romans as Gallia Transalpina, Gaul across the Alps, stretched from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, from the Pyrenees to the Rhine. This vast expanse, larger than Italy itself, was home to dozens of tribes with their own languages, customs, and fierce traditions of independence. Rome had established a tenuous foothold in the southern region, but the interior remained largely unknown, a mysterious land of forests and marshes, of warriors who reportedly collected their enemies' heads and worshipped in sacred groves, guided by enigmatic priests called Druids. When the ambitious proconsul arrived to assume command of his provinces in the early spring of 58 BC, he likely had no master plan for conquering this territory. Fortune, however, soon presented an irresistible opportunity. The Helvetii, a powerful tribe from what is now Switzerland, had decided to migrate en masse into central Gaul, burning their villages behind them as they marched with their families and possessions. Their route would take them through the Roman province or its allied territories. Seizing upon this threat to Roman interests, the new governor mobilized his legions with remarkable speed, defeated the Helvetii in battle, and forced the survivors to return to their homeland. This swift victory might have been sufficient to enhance his military reputation, but larger events were unfolding. The Gallic chieftain Diviciacus, representing the powerful Iadui tribe, arrived at the Roman camp seeking protection against Germanic invaders led by the warlord Ariovistus. Although Rome had previously recognized Ariovistus as a friend of the Roman people, the proconsul instantly grasped the strategic opportunity. Marching northeast, he confronted the Germanic leader in a battle that demonstrated both his tactical brilliance and personal courage, rallying his initially terrified troops to a decisive victory. In a mere season of campaigning, he had established himself as the dominant military power in Gaul and positioned Rome as the protector of Gallic tribes against Germanic incursion. More importantly, he had discovered in himself an unexpected genius for warfare, a combination of boldness, adaptability, and psychological insight that would transform him from a debt-ridden politician into Rome's greatest general. The following spring brought new challenges as the Belgic tribes of northern Gaul, alarmed by Roman incursions, formed a powerful confederation to resist further expansion. Moving with characteristic speed, the Roman commander struck before their alliance could solidify, defeating the Nervi in one of the bloodiest engagements of the campaign. So desperate was the fighting that he personally seized a shield and joined the front ranks, an action that earned him the fervent devotion of his men. Each victory expanded Roman influence and created new frontiers to defend, drawing him deeper into Gallic affairs. The third campaigning season saw Roman forces reach the Atlantic Ocean, securing the submission of the maritime tribes and building a fleet to subdue the Veneti, whose naval expertise initially confounded the Romans. In characteristic fashion, the proconsul's forces adapted their tactics, developing grappling hooks to immobilize the Veneti vessels before boarding and capturing them. With stunning audacity, he twice bridged the Rhine, a feat deemed nearly impossible, to launch brief punitive expeditions into Germanic territory. These operations, while militarily limited, demonstrated Roman engineering prowess and served notice that the natural barrier of the Great River would not protect Germanic tribes who interfered in Gallic affairs. Even more spectacularly, he twice crossed the Channel into Britain, a land so distant and mysterious that some Romans questioned its existence. Though these expeditions yielded little concrete gain besides hostages and promises of tribute, they electrified the Roman public. The man who had once feared being forgotten by history had now literally expanded the boundaries of the known world. Throughout these campaigns, he revealed himself as not merely a battlefield commander, but a master of psychological warfare and political manipulation. He systematically exploited tribal rivalries, alternating between ruthless punishment of resistance and generous treatment of those who submitted. His memoirs, the commentaries on the Gallic War, dictated during winter quarters and sent back to Rome, masterfully shaped public perception of the conflict, emphasizing Roman victories while justifying each escalation as necessary for security. The veneer of civilization he maintained amid the brutality of conquest was itself a strategic asset. He dined from silver plate in the field, maintained correspondence with Roman intellectuals, and received visitors from Rome with elegant hospitality in winter quarters. This cultivated image helped maintain support among the elite, even as his popular acclaim grew with each victory. While slaughtering and enslaving on an industrial scale, he portrayed himself as the reluctant agent of Roman security and Gallic liberation. For 6 years, the conquest proceeded with remarkable success, interrupted only by brief rebellions quickly suppressed. Then, in the winter, as Romans counted 52 years before the birth of Christ, disaster struck. The executed Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix had conceived a desperate strategy for independence, a coordinated national uprising. Under his leadership, tribe after tribe rose in rebellion, slaughtering Roman merchants and isolated garrisons before the legions could mobilize. Unlike previous tribal leaders, Vercingetorix recognized the futility of facing Roman legions in direct battle. He ordered a scorched earth policy, with Gauls burning their own towns and food supplies to deny resources to the Roman army. For the first time in the campaign, the proconsul found himself strategically outmaneuvered, his forces scattered and supply lines threatened. The turning point came at Alesia, where Vercingetorix and his remaining forces took refuge in a hilltop fortress. In one of military history's most remarkable feats of engineering, the Roman army constructed a double line of fortifications, an inner wall to contain the defenders and an outer wall to repel the massive Gallic relief army approaching from outside. Trapped between these concentric fortifications, with his people starving, Vercingetorix eventually surrendered himself to spare his followers. The defeat of Vercingetorix marked the effective end of organized Gallic resistance. Minor rebellions continued for another year, but by the summer before the new decade began, all of Gaul lay under Roman control. A territory of 200,000 square miles and perhaps 8 million inhabitants subjugated in less than 8 years. The human cost had been staggering. By his own account, his armies had killed 1 million Gauls and enslaved another million. Figures that, even if exaggerated, represent catastrophic demographic collapse. Entire tribes were exterminated, ancient cultural traditions disrupted or destroyed, and the region's political organization permanently altered. What Rome celebrated as the pacification of Gaul, modern historians might more accurately describe as genocide. For the ambitious conqueror, however, the campaign had yielded everything he desired. His reputation now eclipsed even Pompey's earlier Eastern triumphs. His wealth, accumulated through plunder and the slave trade, had transformed him from debtor to creditor. Most importantly, his prolonged command had given him something unprecedented in Roman history: a professional army of veterans loyal to their general rather than the distant republic. His soldiers, who had followed him from the Rhine to Britain and back, who had built bridges and siege works that seemed to defy nature itself, who had shared in the glory and wealth of conquest, now identified themselves not as soldiers of Rome, but as Caesar's men. As his Gallic command approached its conclusion, the Senate in Rome watched with mounting alarm. The young spendthrift they had dispatched to a provincial backwater had returned a conquering hero with immense wealth, popular acclaim, and a battle-hardened army loyal to him alone. The Roman historian Suetonius would later write that he had rather not be first among the Gauls than second in Rome. Having achieved the former, he now set his sights unswervingly on eliminating the latter possibility. Events in Rome during his absence had shifted the political landscape dramatically, setting the stage for a confrontation that would determine not just his future, but the fate of the Republic itself. While blood soaked the fields of Gaul, the political alliance that had secured the conqueror's command was unraveling in Rome. The Triumvirate, always an arrangement of convenience rather than conviction, had endured longer than many expected. But in the tumultuous summer of 54 BC, a critical bond was severed. Julia, daughter to one triumvir and wife to another, died in childbirth. Her infant son perished with her. The marriage had been political in conception, but had blossomed into genuine affection. Pompey, genuinely grieving, proposed burying his young wife in his family tomb. The Roman populace, however, insisted she be honored with burial in the Campus Martius, a distinction previously reserved for Rome's greatest public servants. With Julia's death, the family tie between the two rivals was broken. The Triumvirate's third member, Crassus, still provided some equilibrium, but the following year brought fresh disaster when Crassus, seeking military glory to match his partners, launched an ill-conceived invasion of Parthia. At Cari, on the sun-scorched plains of Mesopotamia, his legions met catastrophic defeat. Crassus himself was killed. According to legend, the Parthians poured molten gold down his throat in mockery of his notorious greed. The Triumvirate was no more. Only two power centers remained in Roman politics: Pompey in Rome and his younger rival in Gaul. Between them stood a deepening gulf of mutual suspicion. The Roman capital, meanwhile, descended into chaos. Street violence between rival gangs, led by the populist demagogue Clodius and the conservative enforcer Milo, made normal governance impossible. Elections were postponed amid bribery and bloodshed. The Senate, desperate to restore order, turned to Pompey, appointing him sole consul, an unprecedented emergency measure. Pompey, once the Triumvirate's military titan, had transformed himself into the Senate's champion and defender of constitutional norms. The same conservative faction that had once thwarted his eastern settlements now embraced him as a bulwark against his former allies' ambitions. As street violence culminated in Clodius's murder and the burning of the Senate House, Pompey was granted extraordinary powers to restore order, which he did with efficient severity. The Gallic conqueror observed these developments from across the Alps with mounting concern. His political position was deteriorating precisely as his military situation finally stabilized. His command in Gaul would soon expire, requiring him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen, where enemies eagerly awaited the opportunity to prosecute him for actions during his consulship years earlier. To secure his position, he needed to transition directly from his Gallic command to a second consulship, without the vulnerable interval of private citizenship. Roman law, however, required candidates for consul to appear in person, an impossibility while he retained his provincial command. He requested a dispensation to stand in absentia, citing the precedent of Pompey's own extraordinary commands. The Senate, led by his implacable enemy Cato, refused. Furthermore, they began discussing his recall and replacement in Gaul before his term was complete. The message was clear: return to Rome without your army, and face political destruction, or retain your command in defiance of the Senate and become an enemy of the state. Seeking compromise, he proposed a mutual disarmament. He would relinquish his provinces and legions if Pompey would do the same. This seemingly reasonable suggestion contained a crucial asymmetry. Pompey, as defender of Italy, would always be able to raise new legions. The Gallic commander, once separated from his veteran troops, would lose his only leverage. As tensions mounted, a crucial ally emerged in Rome. Mark Antony, newly elected tribune of the plebs, used his position to advocate for his patron's interests. When the Senate finally moved to declare the proconsul an enemy of the state, Antony and his fellow tribune Cassius exercised their veto, only to be physically threatened by Pompey's supporters. Fleeing Rome, disguised as slaves, they made their way to the proconsul's headquarters in Cisalpine Gaul. This violation of the tribune's sacred person provided the legal pretext the Gallic commander had been waiting for. He could now present his actions not as personal ambition, but as defense of the Roman constitution against a faction that had used force against the people's representatives. On the north bank of a small stream, marking the boundary between his province and Italy proper, he paused with a single legion. The Rubicon was less a river than a symbolic line. Crossing it with armed troops meant irrevocable commitment to civil war. According to Suetonius, he hesitated briefly before uttering the famous words, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast. That momentous crossing on a winter night in early January of 49 BC transformed Roman history. The Republic had endured 5 centuries, weathering external threats from Carthage to the Cimbri and internal convulsions from the Gracchi to Sulla. Now it faced its gravest challenge, not from a revolutionary seeking to overturn the system, but from a traditional politician using extraordinary means to preserve his place within it. As news of the Rubicon crossing reached Rome, panic erupted. Despite his vast advantages of resources and manpower, Pompey had made inadequate preparations for what now seemed inevitable. "I have only to stamp my foot in Italy," he had famously boasted, "and legions will spring up." Reality proved less accommodating. Rather than defend Rome, Pompey made the shocking announcement that the Senate and government would abandon the capital. As his rivals' forces advanced rapidly southward, the defenders fell back toward Brundisium, intending to cross to Greece, where Pompey could mobilize his extensive eastern resources. The psychological impact of this retreat was devastating. For citizens who had been told that the Republic faced a criminal adventurer with minimal support, the government's flight suggested something far more threatening. Municipalities across Italy capitulated without resistance. Former opponents sent messages of support. Even some of Pompey's troops deserted to the advancing force. The man Cato had dismissed as a dissolute spendthrift, the aristocrat rejected by his peers as a dangerous demagogue, the general whose Gallic conquests had been belittled in the Senate, now marched virtually unopposed to claim Rome itself, all without executing a single Roman citizen or allowing his troops to plunder a single Italian town. As Pompey and most of the Senate sailed from Brundisium to Greece, their rival entered Rome for the first time in nearly a decade. The Eternal City had fallen without a fight to the man who claimed to be its defender. The temples stood untouched, the citizens unharmed. But the Republic had suffered a wound from which it would never recover. Standing in the empty Senate house before the handful of senators who had remained, the conqueror could reflect on his extraordinary journey from the Subura to supreme power. But his victory remained incomplete. Across the Adriatic, Pompey was gathering his strength. In Spain, Pompeian legions controlled the western provinces. Africa remained in Republican hands. The civil war had only just begun, and with it, the final chapter in the Republic's long history. Upon entering Rome in the early spring, the newly ascendant commander faced a paradox. He had captured the seat of government, but lacked legitimate authority. The consuls, most senators, and Pompey himself, holder of multiple legal commands, had fled to Greece. Though welcomed by many common citizens tired of senatorial corruption, he required more than popular acclaim to rule. His first acts displayed the pragmatic flexibility that had marked his rise to power. He addressed the remaining senators with unexpected moderation, portraying himself as a reluctant rebel, forced into conflict by extremists who had violated constitutional norms. To the general public, he secured goodwill by opening the state granaries and distributing Pompey's hoarded grain reserves. More controversially, he broke into the sacred treasury in the Temple of Saturn when the keeper of keys refused access. "The time for weapons and laws is distinct," he reportedly told the protesting tribune. When another official objected, he coolly replied, "For me to threaten you is more difficult than to harm you." The temple doors were opened, and the Republic's emergency reserves, untouched even during Hannibal's invasion, were seized to fund his campaign. Unlike Sulla, who had initiated proscriptions and massacres upon taking Rome, the new master showed striking clemency toward his enemies. This policy, while genuinely reflecting his temperament, also served strategic purposes. Each opponent spared became living testimony to his moderation. Each act of mercy widened the gap between Pompeian propaganda, which painted him as a bloodthirsty tyrant, and the reality Romans experienced. Yet the most pressing challenge remained military. Pompey held overwhelming advantages in naval power, control of the wealthy eastern provinces, and the legitimacy conferred by the presence of consuls and majority of the Senate. Even more dangerously, 7 veteran legions loyal to Pompey remained in Spain under his capable lieutenants Afranius and Petreius, threatening to retake Italy from the west, while Pompey himself prepared to invade from the east. Recognizing this strategic dilemma, the rebel general made a decision that stunned contemporaries. "I go to fight an army without a general. I shall return to fight a general without an army." Leaving Mark Antony to secure Italy, he led his forces west into Spain before Pompey could organize his eastern resources. The Spanish campaign revealed his tactical brilliance at its most refined. Rather than risk frontal assault against entrenched Pompeian forces near Ilerda, he engaged in complex maneuvers that gradually cut their supply lines and isolated them from water sources. When summer rain temporarily restored the Pompeians' access to supplies, he responded with an engineering feat, having his men build rafts and establish a bridgehead across the swollen river that separated the armies. Without fighting a major battle, he forced the surrender of Pompey's Spanish legions, whom he treated with such leniency that many subsequently joined his own forces. In his absence, his supporters in Rome had named him dictator, a temporary emergency office with precedents dating back to the earliest republic. Upon his return from Spain, he held this position just long enough to secure his election as consul for the coming year, providing his authority with constitutional legitimacy before resigning the dictatorship. This careful attention to legal forms, even while overturning the substance of republican governance, typified his political approach. With the Western threat neutralized and his position in Italy secured, he could finally confront Pompey directly. The challenge was daunting. Pompey had assembled 9 legions in Greece, supported by auxiliary forces from Rome's eastern client kingdoms. More crucially, his total command of the sea made transporting an invasion force extremely hazardous. By early winter, the newly elected consul had gathered his army at Brundisium on Italy's heel. With insufficient ships to transport his entire force, and Pompey's fleet patrolling the Adriatic, conventional military wisdom dictated waiting until spring. Instead, he shocked his officers by ordering immediate embarkation, personally leading the first contingent across the stormy winter sea to establish a beachhead at Palaest on the Epirot coast. The crossing succeeded, but left half his army still in Italy under Mark Antony, with Pompey's fleet preventing reinforcement. For months, his position grew increasingly precarious as Pompey, with superior numbers, maneuvered to isolate the invaders from supplies and forage. At Dyrrhachium, the two armies constructed elaborate fortifications facing each other, Caesar attempting to encircle Pompey's larger force, Pompey trying to break the encirclement. The deadlock broke with a serious defeat for Caesar when Pompey identified a weak point in his lines and launched a devastating attack. For the first time since crossing the Rubicon, the great gambler faced potential catastrophe. His army narrowly escaped destruction by withdrawing east into Thessaly, with morale severely damaged. Pompey's officers urged immediate pursuit and decisive battle. The more prudent commander himself preferred his successful strategy of attrition, gradually wearing down his opponent's smaller force without risking everything in direct confrontation. But pressure from overconfident senatorial allies, combined with concern about maintaining his coalition of rival interests, pushed Pompey toward the battle his adversary desperately needed. Near the town of Pharsalus, in the summer of 48 BSE, the two greatest generals of the Roman world finally met in direct combat. Pompey commanded nearly twice as many infantry and vastly superior cavalry, which he planned to use in a crushing flanking maneuver. Recognizing this threat, his opponent made a characteristic adaptation, pulling cohorts from his third line to form a fourth, concealed reserves specifically to counter the expected cavalry attack. As the battle unfolded, Pompey's cavalry initially achieved its objective, driving back its opposing numbers. But as they pursued, Caesar's hidden fourth line suddenly emerged, using their pilae, javelins, not as throwing weapons, but as stabbing spears aimed at the horsemen's faces. This unexpected tactic threw the cavalry into confusion, allowing Caesar's infantry to outflank Pompey's now exposed right wing. As his carefully planned attack disintegrated, Pompey suffered what appears to have been a psychological collapse. The general who had conquered the East, who had been hailed as a second Alexander, retreated to his camp while his army was still fighting. When Caesar's troops stormed the camp, he fled disguised in common clothing. The battle ended in complete victory for Caesar, whose troops, recognizing many of their opponents as former comrades from the Spanish campaign, showed unexpected restraint in the pursuit. His policy of clemency reached its zenith as he pardoned prominent enemies, including Marcus Junius Brutus, whose father Pompey had executed during earlier civil conflicts. Pompey himself fled to Egypt, hoping to find refuge with the young King Ptolemy XIII, whose father had received substantial support from Pompey in the past. It was a fatal miscalculation. The king's advisors, fearing Caesar's wrath would follow if they sheltered his enemy, decided instead to present the victor with Pompey's head as a macabre gift. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria pursuing Pompey, he was greeted by a local official carrying the severed head of his great rival. According to Plutarch, he turned away in horror and wept at the ignominious end of Rome's once greatest general. Whether these tears represented genuine grief or calculated public relations is impossible to determine, but his subsequent actions ordering proper funeral rites for Pompey's remains and punishing those responsible for the murder, suggest at least a respect for his adversary's former dignity. With Pompey's death, the civil war's central conflict was resolved, though significant Pompeian forces remained in Africa and Spain. For the victorious general, however, new complications arose from an unexpected source. The royal intrigues of the Ptolemaic court and the ambitions of a young queen named Cleopatra. Alexandria gleamed white against the Mediterranean blue, a city of marble colonnades, grand boulevards, and the greatest library in the ancient world. When the Roman commander arrived with a small force in pursuit of Pompey, he found not his living rival, but a kingdom teetering on the edge of civil war. The boy king Ptolemy XIII, barely into his teens, ruled jointly with his sister wife Cleopatra, the seventh under their father's will. Their power struggle had escalated to open conflict, with the young queen forced into exile while her brother controlled the capital. The king's advisors, particularly the eunuch Pothinus and General Achillas, saw opportunity in the Roman civil war, first eliminating Pompey to curry favor, then attempting to manipulate the newly arrived general to support their faction. They misjudged their man. Striding into the royal palace with the confidence of one who already controlled Rome itself, he established himself as arbiter of the Egyptian succession crisis rather than petitioner for Egyptian support. His small force, just 4,000 men, belied his absolute conviction of authority. When he summoned both royal siblings to appear before him, he did so not as a foreign commander, but as consul of Rome, representative of Egypt's patron power. The young Ptolemy arrived with his court retinue. Cleopatra, forbidden entry to the palace, employed a stratagem that demonstrated her flair for dramatic timing. According to Plutarch, she had herself rolled inside a carpet, likely a bedroll or bag, and smuggled into the Romans' chambers. When the bundle was unfurled, the 21-year-old queen emerged, making an entrance that captured both the moment and, apparently, the interest of her audience. Modern romantic imagination has embellished their first meeting, but practical politics initially defined their relationship. For Cleopatra, the Roman represented her path back to power. For him, the intelligent, cultured queen offered a more pliable ally than her brother, already surrounded by anti-Roman advisors. Their personal connection, whether immediate or developing gradually, became intertwined with strategic calculations that served both their interests. The young Ptolemy, recognizing the direction of Roman favor, fled the palace in protest, inciting the Alexandrian population against the foreign interlopers. General Achillas mobilized the substantial royal army, some 20,000 former soldiers from Pompey's eastern veterans who had settled in Egypt. Suddenly, the arbiter of Egyptian politics found himself besieged in the royal palace, with minimal forces in a hostile foreign capital. Thus began the Alexandrian War, a 9-month conflict that nearly ended the conqueror's career. Cut off from reinforcements, his small force held the palace and harbour against overwhelming numbers. The fighting spread to the harbour, where the Romans burned ships to prevent their capture. The fire leaped to shore, consuming part of the great library, a cultural catastrophe for which he would be blamed. Though modern historians debate the extent of the destruction, his tactical genius manifested in urban warfare, as it had on the plains of Gaul. When the Alexandrians cut off the palace's freshwater supply, his men dug wells. When enemies attacked by sea, he destroyed their fleet with fire. He captured Pharos Island and its vital lighthouse, only to nearly drown during a desperate retreat across the harbour, when a small boat, overloaded with fleeing soldiers, sank beneath him. According to Suetonius, he swam to safety with one hand held above water, protecting his precious military commentaries from the sea. The arrival of reinforcements from Asia Minor, led by Mithridates of Pergamum, finally broke the deadlock. In a coordinated attack, the Romans defeated the Egyptian forces at the Battle of the Nile. The young Ptolemy drowned while fleeing, allegedly weighed down by his golden armor. With opposition eliminated, the Roman commander placed Cleopatra on the throne alongside her younger brother Ptolemy XIV, a nominal co-ruler whom the queen would easily dominate. More significantly, the victory celebration evolved into a leisurely cruise up the Nile on the Queen's royal barge, a floating palace of unimaginable luxury. This famous journey, lasting according to some accounts nearly 2 months, marked a departure from his usual relentless pace. While Pompey's surviving forces regrouped in Africa, while Rome itself struggled under Mark Antony's questionable administration, the conqueror of Gaul dallied in Egypt, enchanted by a queen who combined intellectual brilliance with political ambition. She spoke 9 languages, administered a wealthy kingdom, and claimed descent from Alexander's general Ptolemy, while embodying the divine authority of Egyptian pharaohs. She was not, contrary to later Roman propaganda, merely a seductress, but a shrewd ruler who recognized in the Roman her best hope for maintaining Egypt's independence in a world increasingly dominated by Rome. For his part, the aging general, now in his 50s, balding and increasingly lined, found in Cleopatra a woman who matched his intellect and ambition. Their relationship transcended mere romance to become a genuine partnership of complementary interests. When she bore him a son, Ptolemy Caesar, nicknamed Caesarion, Little Caesar, he acknowledged the boy as his own, though never formally legitimizing him as heir. Their liaison scandalized conservative Romans, who viewed entanglement with a foreign queen as contrary to republican values. The extent of his future plans regarding Egypt remains debated. Would he have attempted to rule as king in Egypt while maintaining republican forms in Rome? Was Caesarion intended as heir to a Mediterranean empire that would unite East and West? Or was the Egyptian sojourn merely a pleasurable interlude before returning to Roman realities? These questions remained unresolved. After 9 months in Alexandria, urgent news finally broke the Egyptian idyll. Pharnaces, son of Rome's old enemy Mithridates, had taken advantage of the civil conflict to seize territories in Asia Minor. Pompey's forces in Africa grew stronger daily, and in Rome itself, Mark Antony's mismanagement had created political chaos. Reluctantly, the Roman commander prepared to depart, leaving behind his pregnant lover and the luxury of the Alexandrian court. His farewell gift demonstrated both his power and his commitment to Cleopatra's security. 3 legions to ensure her control of Egypt against internal and external threats. With this substantial Roman garrison, the queen's position was unassailable, and Egypt itself became effectively a Roman protectorate, though maintaining nominal independence. As his galley sailed from Alexandria's great harbour in the spring of 47 BC, he left behind more than a lover, an unborn child. His Egyptian sojourn had transformed his public image. No longer merely a Roman general fighting for position within the Republic, he had now lived openly as consort to a foreign monarch, embracing royal luxury and accepting divine honours in the Egyptian manner. The man who had crossed the Rubicon to defend his dignitas as a Roman nobleman had himself changed in ways that would profoundly affect the Republic's final chapter. His next campaign against Pharnaces in Asia Minor would prove so swift and decisive that he summarized it in the famous words, Veni, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. But the man who returned to Rome had seen more than battlefields in his eastern adventures. He had glimpsed a different model of rule, monarchy justified by divine right rather than annual election, administration by royal decree rather than senatorial debate, a society where power flowed from a single source rather than the competing authorities of Rome's complex constitution. Whether these experiences planted the seeds for his subsequent approach to power, or merely reinforced existing tendencies, their influence would soon become evident as he set about reorganizing the Roman state along lines that looked increasingly monarchical to traditional republican eyes. The Rome to which the victorious general returned in the autumn of 47 BC bore little resemblance to the functioning republic he had left years earlier. Mark Antony's mismanagement as his representative had allowed social unrest to fester. The firebrand tribune, Dolabella, had revived proposals for debt cancellation, setting creditors and debtors at violent odds. Mutiny had erupted among veteran legions in Campania, impatient for promised rewards. And beyond Italy's shores, Pompey's sons had rallied substantial forces in Africa, preparing to avenge their father. His return initially brought stability through decisive action. The mutinous legions, who had defied other commanders, fell silent when their general suddenly appeared among them. Addressing them not as soldiers, but as civilians, quirites, a deliberate insult to men who prided themselves on martial identity, he shamed them into renewed loyalty. When they begged to be reinstated under his command, he agreed with calculated reluctance, knowing he would need these veterans for campaigns to come. The social conflicts in Rome required both force and concession. He suppressed Dolabella's radical debt proposals while instituting more moderate relief, cancelling accumulated interest and allowing property to be assessed at pre-war values for debt settlement. This middle path alienated extremists on both sides while satisfying the moderate majority, a characteristic solution that respected property rights while acknowledging the legitimate grievances of debtors. With domestic matters temporarily stabilized, he turned to the remaining military threat. Cato, Scipio, and other republican diehards had assembled 14 legions in Africa, allied with King Juba of Numidia. After brief preparations, the dictator, a title the Senate had granted him for 1 year, sailed with 8 legions to confront this final concentration of Pompeian resistance. The African campaign initially proved challenging. His troops, accustomed to Gallic and European conditions, struggled with the unfamiliar terrain and hit-and-run tactics of Numidian cavalry. For months, the opposing forces maneuvered without decisive engagement until at Thapsus in April 46 BC, battle was finally joined. Unlike Pharsalus, where he had maintained tight control over his troops, at Thapsus his soldiers charged without orders, unleashing a slaughter that claimed nearly 50,000 lives. Most significant was the aftermath. While the dictator maintained his policy of clemency toward Roman opponents, many chose suicide over surrender. Cato the Younger, his most principled adversary, took his own life at Utica, rather than accept pardon from a man he considered the Republic's destroyer. The dictator's reported comment, "Cato, I begrudge you your death as you begrudged me the opportunity to spare your life," reflected genuine respect for an opponent whose incorruptible defense of Republican principles represented everything lacking in Rome's compromised political class. Returning to Rome in July 46 BC, the dictator celebrated 4 consecutive triumphs. For victories in Gaul, Egypt, Pontus, and Africa, the unprecedented spectacle lasted days, with captured treasures, exotic animals, and defeated enemies, though notably not Roman citizens, paraded through streets lined with cheering crowds. Soldiers marched behind their general's chariot, singing ribald verses mocking his personal habits and alleged affairs, a traditional practice meant to ward off divine jealousy by tempering glory with humiliation. Amid the celebration, Romans glimpsed moments that hinted at monarchical aspirations. When the dictator failed to rise as the Senate approached during ceremonies, it provoked whispers of royal ambition. His supporters countered that he suffered a seizure, the falling sickness, epilepsy, that occasionally afflicted him. Whether physical ailment or calculated insult, the incident damaged his carefully cultivated image as first among equals rather than aspiring king. Now secure in power, he turned to governing. His reforms addressed fundamental problems that the Senate had neglected for generations. To reduce urban unemployment, he established overseas colonies for 80,000 veterans and poor citizens. To address Rome's chaotic calendar, which had drifted far from the solar year, he introduced the Julian calendar, designed by Alexandrian astronomer Sosigenes, which would remain standard throughout Europe until the 16th century AD. He reformed the grain dole to prevent abuse, launched ambitious building projects to improve infrastructure while creating jobs, extended citizenship to doctors and teachers regardless of origin, and reorganized municipal administration throughout Italy. These practical reforms revealed his vision of Rome not merely as conqueror of the Mediterranean, but as its civilizing administrator. Most controversial was his restructuring of the Senate itself. The civil wars had depleted the traditional body, with many senators dead or in exile. He expanded membership from 600 to 900, including not just Italians, but provincial elites from Gaul and Spain. Traditionalists fumed at the presence of former enemies and barbarians in Rome's most exclusive assembly. One popular joke asked for directions to the Senate House, as new members from Gaul allegedly couldn't find it. For supporters, these changes represented necessary modernization of institutions that had failed to evolve with Rome's expansion. For opponents, they constituted a deliberate dilution of senatorial authority, creating a body too large to effectively oppose the dictator and too dependent on his patronage to function independently. Perhaps most telling was his treatment of opponents. After Thapsus, most surviving Pompeians accepted his clemency and returned to public life, though without their former influence. His policy of reconciliation, captured in the phrase, "Let this be the end," seemed genuine, yet the underlying message was clear. The Republic would continue in form, but genuine opposition would not be tolerated. This contradictory approach, maintaining republican institutions while emptying them of independent authority, characterized his rule. He accepted election as consul alongside controlled colleagues. He permitted the Senate to meet and pass decrees, though meaningful decisions were made elsewhere. He allowed elections, though his recommendations invariably prevailed. As ancient historian Cassius Dio observed, Rome was, in name, a republic, but in fact, he was an absolute ruler. Fresh conflict interrupted these domestic arrangements when news arrived that Pompey's sons, Gnaeus and Sextus, had raised new forces in Spain. Leaving trusted deputies to administer Rome, the dictator departed for his final military campaign in November 46 BC, determined to extinguish the last embers of resistance. The Spanish campaign culminated at Munda in March 45 BC, where he faced his most desperate battle. The fighting grew so intense that he reportedly dismounted, seized a shield, and advanced to the front lines, shouting, "Do you mean to hand over your general to boys?" His veterans, shamed by this display and inspired by his personal courage, redoubled their efforts and eventually broke the enemy line. 30,000 Pompeians perished, including Gnaeus Pompey, though his brother Sextus escaped to continue resistance at sea. The victory at Munda marked the definitive end of organized opposition. When news reached Rome, the Senate, eager to demonstrate loyalty, voted unprecedented honors. The title Dictator Perpetuo, Dictator for Life. A golden throne in the Senate. A statue among those of the kings of Rome, and his image on Roman coins. The first living Roman to receive this honor, previously reserved for gods and mythical figures. His fifth and final triumph, celebrating the Spanish victory, proved controversial even among supporters. Unlike previous triumphs over foreign enemies, this one commemorated victory over Roman citizens, a distinction carefully observed in prior celebrations. The spectacle left many feeling they witnessed not the culmination of civil war, but the celebration of its architect. As summer turned to autumn in 45 BC, the conqueror of Gaul, Egypt, Pontus, Africa, and Spain stood at the pinnacle of power. All significant military forces answered to him alone. The Senate functioned as his instrument rather than constitutional check. Even the calendar itself had been reformed according to his decree, with the month of Quintilis renamed Julius, July, in his honor. Yet the achievement remained incomplete. He had won absolute power, but not resolved the fundamental question. Would Rome return to genuine republican government, or transform into some new political form better suited to administering a vast empire? His own intentions remained ambiguous, perhaps deliberately so. While rejecting the title of king when offered by supporters, he accumulated powers and honors indistinguishable from monarchy. As he prepared for his next grand project, a massive military campaign against Parthia to avenge Crassus's defeat, fate was preparing to intervene. Among his pardoned enemies and seeming supporters, a conspiracy was forming. Men who owed their lives to his clemency were secretly plotting to kill him, not for what he had done, but for what they feared he would become. The victor of a dozen pitched battles, conqueror of 1,000,000 square miles of territory, and master of Rome itself, now faced his greatest challenge: governance. Military conquest, for all its complexity, follows certain rules. Politics in a republic transitioning toward monarchy presents more subtle hazards. Having won supreme power, the question remained: what would he do with it? The final months of 45 BC saw the dictator Perpetuo unveil an ambitious agenda for reshaping the Roman state. He initiated a comprehensive census of the entire republic, the first accurate accounting of Rome's population, territories, and resources. He commissioned a complete map of the empire and directed teams of Greek surveyors to measure major roads radiating from Rome, creating a geographic understanding that would facilitate administration. His building programs transformed the capital's physical appearance while addressing practical needs. He drained the Pontine marshes to create farmland and reduce malarial disease. He expanded the Forum with a magnificent new plaza dominated by a temple to Venus Genetrix, divine ancestress of the Julian family. He planned a massive public library under the supervision of the scholar Varro. Most ambitiously, he initiated plans to divert the Tiber River to create a new deep-water port at Ostia, a project that would be completed only generations later. These practical improvements reflected his pragmatic approach to power, concrete benefits for citizens rather than merely symbolic authority. Yet alongside these utilitarian projects came increasingly monarchical displays. He appeared in public wearing triumphal regalia, traditionally reserved for one-day celebrations. His portrait appeared on coins with titles and symbols previously associated with kingship. His statue stood among the ancient kings of Rome, bearing the inscription, "To the unconquerable God." The Senate, now expanded and populated with his supporters, became an instrument of his will rather than a deliberative body. He received foreign envoys seated on a golden throne, not rising even when the entire Senate entered. An incident that, according to Suetonius, aroused such indignation that it was listed among the grievances cited by his assassins. When Mark Antony publicly offered him a diadem during the Lupercalia festival in February 44 BC, he theatrically refused it, though critics noted the refusal seemed rehearsed, testing public reaction to potential kingship. His legislative program showed similar contradictions between republican form and monarchical substance. He enacted numerous reforms, limiting jury service to senators and equites, restricting terms of provincial governors to prevent entrenched corruption, establishing standard administrative practices across Italy, and regulating professional guilds to ensure public services. Each measure addressed legitimate problems, yet each also increased central authority at the expense of traditional aristocratic privilege. Most controversially, he expanded Roman citizenship and Senate membership to include provincial elites, particularly from Gaul and Spain. These men wearing togas and unfamiliar with the Senate House, as critics called them, represented his vision of Rome as center of a unified Mediterranean civilization, rather than merely conqueror of subject peoples. This inclusive approach secured provincial loyalty while diluting the power of old Roman families, a policy simultaneously progressive and self-serving. His economic reforms proved similarly double-edged. He addressed crushing debt through partial cancellation while respecting fundamental property rights, disappointing radicals who demanded complete abolition while alienating creditors who faced significant losses. He established new colonies for veterans and the urban poor, relieving social pressure in Rome while creating loyal Roman enclaves throughout the Mediterranean. He reformed coinage to establish consistent standards, facilitating trade while increasing central control over money supply. In his personal style, the dictator maintained calculated informality while wielding absolute power. He dined with citizens from all classes, granted ready access to ordinary petitioners, and displayed leniency toward critics, allowing Cicero to publish a eulogy for Cato without reprisal. Yet he also required senators to take an oath supporting all his actions, past and future, a demand that made constitutional governance impossible. His religious policy revealed similar tensions. Though holding the position of Pontifex Maximus, chief priest, he displayed notably skeptical views in private. According to contemporaries, he openly questioned afterlife beliefs during a Senate debate, shocking more traditional members. Yet he cultivated divine associations for political purposes, emphasizing his family's descent from Venus and accepting statues depicting him with godlike attributes. This complex approach, republican form concealing increasingly monarchical substance, reflected genuine uncertainty about Rome's political future. The old republic had failed. Its institutions had proven inadequate for governing a vast empire and preventing civil conflict. Yet no clear alternative had emerged. He appeared to be testing boundaries, experimenting with forms of governance that preserved familiar structures, while concentrating effective authority in a single ruler. By early 44 BC, his position seemed unassailable. The Senate had declared him dictator perpetuo, dictator for life. His statue stood in the temple of Quirinus with the inscription, "To the Invincible God." Coins bore his portrait, an honor previously reserved for deities and abstract personifications. Foreign kings sent embassies addressing him with royal titles. His word effectively constituted law. As winter turned to spring, he finalized plans for his next great venture, a massive eastern campaign against the Parthian Empire. This expedition would avenge Crassus's humiliating defeat at Carrhae, secure Rome's eastern frontier, and potentially extend Roman territory as far as India. His military preparations were characteristically meticulous. 16 legions and 10,000 cavalry would accompany him on a campaign expected to last at least 3 years. Before departing, he arranged for administration during his absence. Key supporters received appointments to major offices for years in advance, an unprecedented arrangement that effectively suspended electoral competition. Mark Antony would serve as consul, Lepidus as his master of horse, and various loyalists as praetors and aediles. The expanded Senate, packed with provincial appointees and pardoned opponents, would provide an appearance of constitutional legitimacy. The imminent departure also necessitated addressing succession, implicitly acknowledging the monarchical nature of his position. His grandnephew and adopted heir, Gaius Octavius, later Augustus, would remain in Rome, continuing his education while being gradually introduced to public life. Other young men of ability, including Marcus Junius Brutus, whose life he had spared at Pharsalus, received positions of responsibility, creating a cadre of potential successors should he fall in battle. What remains disputed is whether he intended permanent monarchy or merely extended emergency powers. His admirers argued he planned to restore genuine republican governance once institutions had been reformed and external threats neutralized. His critics saw in every action evidence of insatiable ambition for permanent royal power. The answer likely lies somewhere between: a transitional authority that would eventually institutionalize itself as a constitutional monarchy, preserving republican forms while establishing dynastic succession. We will never know for certain. In the Curia of Pompey, on the Ides of March, 44 BC, 60 senators, many of them beneficiaries of his clemency, ended these ambiguities with their daggers. The man who had conquered Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, and transformed Rome's governance died at the foot of Pompey's statue. His plans for Parthian conquest and constitutional reform dying with him. In his final moments, according to ancient sources, he drew his toga over his face when he recognized Brutus among the assassins, uttering in Greek, "You too, my child," words immortalized by Shakespeare as "et tu, Brute." Whether expressing paternal disappointment or merely dignity in death, these final words captured the personal betrayal that paralleled Rome's political tragedy. The Republic had killed its most capable son, only to discover that the wounds inflicted during decades of civil strife could not be healed by a single act of violence, however dramatic. The conspirators who struck 23 blows against a single man failed to understand that they attacked not merely a dictator, but a system that had evolved beyond traditional republican constraints. They killed a man, but not the forces that had propelled him to power, forces that would soon propel his heir toward even more thoroughgoing transformation of Roman governance. Beyond the general who conquered Gaul, beyond the dictator who transformed Rome, stood a human being of extraordinary complexity. To understand the historical impact, we must understand the man who shaped events as much as he was shaped by them. Physically, he presented a study in contrasts. Tall and slender by Roman standards, with fair skin and piercing dark eyes, he combined aristocratic refinement with remarkable physical endurance. Despite his lifelong battle with epilepsy, the falling sickness that occasionally struck him in moments of stress, he routinely outmarched his legions, swam rivers in full armor, and rode for days with minimal rest. Suetonius notes that he often dictated letters to 2 or more secretaries simultaneously while traveling, demonstrating exceptional mental agility. His famous vanity regarding his thinning hair became the subject of jokes even among his own troops, who sang ribald verses about the bald adulterer during triumphal processions. He combed his remaining strands forward to conceal his receding hairline, and received with evident pleasure the Senate's decree allowing him to permanently wear a laurel wreath, ostensibly to honor his victories, but conveniently concealing his baldness. When offered a triumph or consulship early in his career, he chose the consulship, reportedly saying, "Better to be first in authority among the living than first in a procession once." This vanity extended beyond appearance to historical legacy. From his earliest campaigns, he meticulously documented his achievements in commentaries written in lucid, elegant Latin. These works, particularly the Gallic Wars and Civil War, stand as masterpieces of propaganda disguised as objective reporting. Written in the third person with seeming detachment, they systematically justified his actions while magnifying his accomplishments. His prose style, praised even by critics like Cicero for its stripped-down, elegant simplicity, set literary standards for generations. His intellectual life defied the stereotype of the unthinking soldier. Fluent in Greek as well as Latin, he composed works on grammar, astronomy, and rhetoric that have mostly been lost to history. His calendar reform demonstrated sophisticated understanding of astronomy and mathematics. His strategic innovations revealed a mind that constantly questioned conventional approaches. Even during the most intense campaigns, he maintained correspondence with leading intellectuals and patronized artists and scholars. His personal relationships revealed similar complexity. Married 3 times to Cornelia, Pompeia, and Calpurnia, he proved a devoted husband to his first wife, but divorced his second after a political scandal. Though his marriage to Calpurnia appeared stable, his romantic life became notorious for affairs with women like Servilia, mother of Brutus, and foreign queens, particularly Cleopatra. His dalliances with men, including King Nicomedes of Bithynia, earned him the mocking title Queen of Bithynia from political opponents. Though such behavior fell within acceptable Roman norms for the dominant partner, these relationships, while sometimes genuinely affectionate, frequently served political purposes. His affair with Servilia created useful connections to her influential family. His marriage to Pompeia, granddaughter of Sulla, temporarily aligned him with conservative factions. His relationship with Cleopatra secured Egypt's resources for his cause. Even his famed generosity and friendship operated within a calculated system of political alliances and obligations. This fusion of genuine feeling with political calculation typified his approach to all relationships. He inspired remarkable personal loyalty, from soldiers who followed him into seemingly hopeless battles, from pardoned enemies who joined his cause, from citizens who benefited from his reforms. Yet this charisma always served strategic ends, building the network of supporters necessary for his ambitions. His notorious clemency toward defeated enemies, a policy at odds with Roman traditions of vengeance, similarly combined genuine temperament with political advantage. By sparing men like Brutus, Cassius, and Cicero after Pharsalus, he displayed magnanimity that contrasted with Marian and Sullan atrocities. Yet this mercy also converted former opponents into public demonstrations of his benevolence, their very presence in Rome testifying to his superiority. Financial matters revealed further contradictions. Chronically indebted in his early career, at one point owing the staggering sum of 25 million denarii, he displayed cavalier disregard for financial limitations. He spent lavishly on public games, private hospitality, and political bribes, viewing money as merely a tool for advancement rather than wealth to be accumulated. Yet after his conquests brought unprecedented riches to his personal treasury, he implemented careful financial reforms for the Republic, standardizing currency and regulating public expenditures with unexpected fiscal discipline. Perhaps most fundamentally contradictory was his relationship to tradition and innovation. Born to one of Rome's oldest patrician families, educated in ancestral customs, he presented himself as defender of Roman dignity and honor. Yet his actions repeatedly broke with precedent, from crossing the Rubicon with armed troops to accepting foreign religious honors. He simultaneously exploited conservative reverence for tradition, while systematically undermining traditional constraints on individual power. His religious attitudes displayed similar duality. As Pontifex Maximus, he fulfilled Rome's highest religious office with public piety. Yet in private, he expressed skeptical views more aligned with Epicurean philosophy than traditional beliefs. When augurs reported unfavorable omens before a battle, he reportedly dismissed their concerns, saying, "They will be more favorable when I choose." This tension between public conformity and private skepticism characterized his approach to many aspects of Roman life. His character contained elements that seem irreconcilable: ruthless ambition with genuine concern for social reform, personal courage with calculated self-preservation, literary refinement with brutal warfare, republican heritage with monarchical aspiration. Rather than viewing these as contradictions, we might understand them as adaptations to a political environment that required multiple personas for survival and advancement. The Romans themselves struggled to define this multifaceted character. Cicero, who alternately opposed and supported him, wrote to a friend, "I know whom to flee, but not whom to follow." His assassins justified their action as tyrannicide, while his supporters deified him as Rome's savior. Even modern historians remain divided, some portraying him as democratic reformer, others as proto-fascist dictator, still others as pragmatic modernizer. Perhaps the truest assessment comes from understanding him as a transitional figure, born into a republic whose contradictions were becoming untenable, gifted with abilities that allowed him to exploit those contradictions, and ultimately destroyed by his attempt to resolve them through personal authority rather than institutional reform. His greatest talent may have been adaptation to rapidly changing circumstances, a quality that allowed his spectacular rise, but could not ultimately protect him from the consequences of the changes he himself accelerated. The complexity of the man defies simple judgment. He was neither the democratic hero portrayed by some admirers, nor the one-dimensional tyrant described by enemies. He was, instead, a singular individual whose extraordinary combination of intelligence, ambition, and opportunity placed him at the fulcrum of history. A man who, in attempting to save the Republic from its contradictions, instead transformed it beyond recognition. While the dictator finalized plans for his Parthian expedition in the early months of 44 BC, a shadow conspiracy took shape among Rome's elite. The plot that would change history began not with the disadvantaged or oppressed, but with privileged men who had largely benefited from the new regime. Senators, former enemies, granted clemency, and even personal friends of the man they planned to kill. Their motives defied simple categorization. Some conspirators, like Gaius Cassius Longinus, harbored personal grievances, passed over for promotion, or denied expected honors. Others, like Marcus Junius Brutus, claimed philosophical opposition to concentrated power, viewing themselves as defenders of republican liberty against encroaching monarchy. Still others feared losing privileges and position in the new order taking shape under the dictator's reforms. What united this diverse group was the conviction that one man's death could restore the republic they envisioned, or perhaps more accurately, the republic that had served their class so well for centuries. Brutus emerged as the conspiracy's moral center, though not its original instigator. His personal history made his participation particularly significant. His mother, Servilia, had been the dictator's longtime lover, creating rumors that Brutus might actually be his illegitimate son. A biological connection Plutarch dismisses based on chronology, but which added psychological complexity to their relationship. More concretely, the dictator had spared Brutus's life after Pharsalus, despite his fighting for Pompey, later appointing him governor of Cisalpine Gaul and praetor for 44 BC. This personal connection made Brutus's recruitment essential to the conspirators. His ancestor, another Lucius Junius Brutus, had overthrown Rome's last king nearly 5 centuries earlier, establishing the Republic itself. This heritage gave the younger Brutus symbolic importance beyond his individual standing. Anonymous messages appeared at his tribunal, reading, "You are not a Brutus," and "If only Brutus were alive." Psychological prods likely planted by Cassius to manipulate him into joining the conspiracy. Cassius himself presented a stark contrast to Brutus's philosophical idealism. A skilled military commander who had saved Syria from Parthian invasion after Crassus's defeat, he combined practical competence with burning ambition. His decision to approach Brutus came after being passed over for the prestigious urban praetorship in favor of Brutus, despite his greater seniority. According to Plutarch, personal resentment rather than republican principle motivated Cassius. The dictator had once dismissed him, saying, "What does Cassius want? I do not like him much, for he is pale and lean." Once Brutus committed to the cause, recruitment accelerated. Prominent senators like Tillius Cimber, Decimus Brutus, and Gaius Trebonius joined the conspiracy. Men who had fought for the dictator in the civil war and now enjoyed positions in his administration. This paradox pervaded the conspiracy. Those plotting to restore the Republic were largely beneficiaries of the regime they sought to overthrow. Of the approximately 60 conspirators, virtually all had received pardons, appointments, or other advantages from the man they now plotted to kill. The decision to assassinate rather than legally remove the dictator reflected political reality. The Senate, packed with his appointees, would never vote to rescind his powers. The popular assemblies, beneficiaries of his reforms and largesse, remained firmly supportive. Only elimination offered the conspirators hope of restoring their vision of the Republic, a vision notably lacking specific plans for addressing the social and economic problems that had led to civil conflict in the first place. Debate among the conspirators centered on practical questions: where and when to strike, and who else might need elimination. Some advocated killing Mark Antony along with his patron, recognizing his potential to rally supporters and seek vengeance. Brutus vetoed this expansion, arguing that killing anyone beyond the dictator would transform an act of liberation into a partisan bloodbath, undermining its legitimacy. This decision, made on moral principle, would later prove a critical strategic error. The chosen opportunity emerged in mid-March. The Senate would meet on the Ides, the 15th, not in its normal chamber, but in the theatre of Pompey, where the dictator would appear to conduct business before departing for his Parthian campaign. The location carried powerful symbolism. The grand complex built by Pompey, whose death the assassins would now avenge in the shadow of his statue. The public setting would allow conspirators to approach without arousing suspicion, while the presence of the full Senate would provide immediate witnesses to their claimed act of liberation. Planning proceeded with remarkable discretion. Despite the conspiracy's size, no direct evidence of the plot reached the dictator, though warning signs accumulated. The soothsayer Spurina famously advised him to beware the Ides of March, a warning he acknowledged but did not act upon. His wife Calpurnia experienced disturbing nightmares the evening before the planned assassination, dreaming of holding his bloodied body. A sacrificial animal was found without a heart when cut open, an omen so troubling that even the skeptical ruler momentarily hesitated in his plans. Most tellingly, a senator named Tullius Cimber prepared to present a petition on behalf of his exiled brother at the meeting, a pretext to approach closely with others gathering around in support. Servant to several masters before choosing the Republic, Cimber would initiate the fateful action by grabbing the purple toga of the man his group now privately called the King. As the Ides of March dawned over Rome, neither the conspirators nor their target could predict the consequences of their actions. The plotters believed one death would restore the Republic. The dictator assumed his clemency had secured his position. Both would prove catastrophically wrong. The Republic the conspirators sought to save had already transformed beyond recognition, and the vacuum created by removing its central figure would unleash forces far more destructive than any single man's ambition. Dawn broke over Rome with a heavy atmosphere. Clouds hung low over the 7 hills, and a damp chill pervaded the city streets. In his home on the Palatine, the dictator woke troubled after a restless night. His wife Calpurnia, normally reserved and stoic, pleaded with unusual emotion that he remain home. Her dreams had been filled with omens, a falling pediment from their house, his statue streaming with blood, herself holding his murdered body. Ordinarily dismissive of superstition, he hesitated. When the sacrificial animals were opened and found without hearts, an unprecedented portent, even his skepticism wavered. According to Suetonius, he briefly considered postponing the Senate meeting, more to calm his wife's fears than from personal concern. This moment of indecision was interrupted by the arrival of Decimus Brutus, ironically, one of the conspirators, a trusted lieutenant who had commanded his fleet during the Civil War. Decimus now used their friendship to ensure the plot proceeded. Mocking the influence of dreams and omens over Rome's greatest general, he argued that postponement would insult the assembled senators. More persuasively, he noted the scheduled business included a proposal to grant the dictator the title of king for territories outside Italy, a preliminary step toward the Eastern monarchy many believed he desired. Swayed by these arguments, and perhaps by concern for his dignitas, the personal honor and reputation that had driven his career, he decided to attend briefly despite continuing unease. The dangers are not so much in the omens as in causing disappointment, he reportedly told Calpurnia as he departed. This small concession to political appearances over personal caution would prove fatal. His journey to the theatre of Pompey was marked by further warnings. The soothsayer Spurina, who had earlier warned him about the Ides of March, stood along the route. According to Plutarch, the dictator remarked with mild sarcasm, "The Ides of March have come," to which Spurina ominously replied, "Aye, they have come, but they have not passed." A final warning came from a supporter named Artemidorus, who thrust a written message detailing the conspiracy into his hands. Preoccupied with greeting citizens and receiving petitions, he added the unread document to papers he would review during the Senate meeting. Around 60 conspirators had positioned themselves in the Theatre of Pompey complex built by his old rival. Some mingled among the other senators in the meeting chamber. Others stationed themselves to prevent interference or secure escape routes. All carried concealed daggers, weapons forbidden in the Senate, but hidden beneath togas or in document cases. The plan required careful coordination. Tullius Cimber would approach with a petition, then grab the dictator's toga. This would signal Casca to strike the first blow. followed by coordinated attacks from all conspirators to prevent escape or resistance. The dictator arrived in a litter rather than walking, a detail that concerned the conspirators as it suggested possible illness that might lead to postponement. Their anxiety heightened when he paused before entering, conducting further sacrifices whose results troubled the attending priests. Mark Antony, whose physical strength and loyalty made him a potential threat to the plot, briefly engaged him in conversation outside, raising fears that he might have been warned. But ultimately, the dictator proceeded into the chamber, with Antony detained outside by Trebonius through manufactured conversation. As he moved toward his golden chair, positioned before Pompey's statue, the Senate rose in traditional respect. No unusual tension showed on the conspirators' faces. These were men experienced in war and politics, skilled at concealing intentions. The session opened with routine matters before Tullius Cimber approached with his petition regarding his exiled brother. Other conspirators followed, creating a small crowd around the seated ruler, effectively blocking him from the view of non-conspirators. When the dictator dismissed the petition with a gesture suggesting it would be addressed later, Cimber grabbed the purple-bordered toga with both hands, pulling it down from his shoulders, the signal to attack. "Why, this is violence," the dictator exclaimed as Publius Servilius Casca struck the first blow. The dagger, poorly aimed in Casca's nervousness, only grazed his chest. The dictator seized Casca's arm, shouting in Latin, "Casca, what are you doing?" and stabbed at his assailant with his stylus, the metal writing implement being his only weapon. This brief resistance ended as the other conspirators surrounded him. From all sides came dagger thrusts, to his face, his chest, his limbs. According to Eutropius, he initially fought back, until he saw Marcus Brutus among his attackers. At this sight, his protege, and possibly his lover's son, joining the assault, he reportedly uttered in Greek, "Kai su teknon," "You too, my child," words later immortalized by Shakespeare as "et tu, brute." Whether giving up in resignation or simply overwhelmed, he drew his toga over his face and ceased resistance. 23 dagger wounds were later counted on his body, though according to the physician Antistius, only one was fatal, a thrust between the ribs that penetrated his heart. He collapsed at the base of Pompey's statue, which was spattered with his blood. The final indignity came as conspirators collided in their frenzied attack, accidentally wounding each other in their determination to share responsibility for the deed. The assault lasted only minutes. As the dictator fell, the conspirators raised their blood-stained daggers and shouted, "Liberty! Freedom! Tyranny is dead!" expecting cheers from liberated brother senators. Instead, they met stunned silence followed by panic. Non-conspirator senators fled the chamber in terror, believing the attack might be part of a larger purge. The assassins found themselves momentarily confused, masters of the Senate chamber, but uncertain how to secure their revolution beyond its walls. Brutus attempted to deliver a prepared speech justifying their actions, but addressed only a rapidly emptying room. The conspirators had killed the dictator, but had no immediate plan to fill the vacuum of power his death created. Their assumption that the Republic would naturally reclaim its traditional function once its subverter was removed proved instantly naive. Outside the Senate, news of the assassination spread rapidly through a city already tense with rumors. The conspirators marched to the capital with their bloodied daggers, proclaiming restoration of liberty, but found an unexpectedly muted public response. Common citizens, who had benefited most from the dictator's reforms, displayed confusion or hostility rather than the anticipated gratitude. Veterans of his campaigns, thousands of whom lived in the city, awaiting settlement in promised colonies, presented a particular danger to the assassins claiming to have liberated Rome. By nightfall, the conspirators had barricaded themselves on the Capitoline Hill, protected by gladiators hired by Decimus Brutus, as the city below simmered with uncertainty. Their bold strike had eliminated the dictator, but left his power structure largely intact. Mark Antony, initially fearing inclusion in the purge, quickly recovered his composure and secured the dictator's house and papers, gaining control of both his official correspondence and substantial treasury. As darkness fell over Rome, the body of history's most famous assassination victim remained temporarily forgotten on the Senate floor. The man who had conquered Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, and reformed Rome's calendar, left alone in the gathering shadows. Eventually, 3 household slaves placed his corpse on a litter and carried it to his home, one arm hanging limply from beneath the covering. The republic that conspirators claimed to have liberated had received a wound far deeper than the 23 inflicted on its most controversial citizen. The coming days would reveal whether that wound might heal, or if it would fester into renewed civil war more destructive than any single man's ambition. The conspirators who retreated to the Capitoline Hill on the evening of the Ides of March had achieved their immediate goal but failed to secure their revolution. Having removed the dictator, they discovered that killing a man proved easier than killing the idea he had come to represent. As dawn broke on March 16th, they faced a city not celebrating liberation, but simmering with dangerous uncertainty. Mark Antony, the surviving consul, moved with decisive opportunism during the crucial hours following the assassination. After ensuring his own safety, he secured the dictator's residence, taking possession of his papers, an enormous personal treasury, approximately 100 million sesterces. This single act provided him with both the financial resources for a potential power struggle and insight into the dictator's plans and connections. He also gained custody of the will, a document whose contents would dramatically alter the political landscape. The day after the assassination witnessed political maneuvering from all factions. Brutus addressed the populace from the Capitol, delivering a carefully reasoned speech justifying the assassination as necessary to preserve Roman liberty. His oratory, while eloquent, resonated primarily with those already sympathetic to the Republican cause, the aristocratic families and conservative elements who had chafed under the dictator's dominance. The common citizens, who had benefited most from the dictator's reforms and largesse, received these abstract appeals to traditional liberty with notable coolness. Cicero, the great orator who had maintained an ambiguous position during the dictator's rise, now proposed a general amnesty, forgiveness for the assassins paired with ratification of the dictator's acts and appointments. This compromise aimed to prevent immediate civil conflict while preserving the constitutional structure. In a Senate hastily assembled in the temple of Tellus, Earth, safely distant from both the assassination site and potential public disturbances, this proposal gained majority support. The apparent truce masked deeper calculations. For the conspirators, amnesty provided breathing room to consolidate their position. For Antony and other Caesarians, maintaining the dictator's acts preserved their offices and powers while they assessed their strength. Neither side viewed the arrangement as permanent, merely as preparation for the coming power struggle. The critical turning point came with the public reading of the dictator's will. Antony, recognizing its explosive potential, arranged for this reading to follow the funeral, weaponizing grief before revealing the final evidence of the dictator's public generosity. The document contained several provisions that would reshape the political landscape. First, the dictator had adopted his grandnephew, Gaius Octavius, later known as Octavian, then Augustus, as his primary heir, granting him 3/4 of his vast estate, and more significantly, his name. This 18-year-old student in Apollonia, previously a minor figure in the dictator's entourage, suddenly became Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, son of the martyred leader and claimant to his political legacy. Second, the will granted substantial gifts to the Roman people, 300 sesterces to each citizen, and the dedication of the dictator's gardens across the Tiber for public use. This posthumous generosity underscored the image of a leader devoted to public welfare rather than personal enrichment, contrasting sharply with the aristocratic conspirators who claimed to have liberated the people. The funeral itself, masterfully orchestrated by Antony, transformed public sentiment from uncertainty to vengeful rage. The body, displayed in the forum on an ivory couch, bore visible evidence of the 23 wounds. Antony's funeral oration, which Shakespeare would later immortalize, balanced restraint with calculated emotional manipulation. Rather than directly condemning the conspirators, still protected by the amnesty, he simply recounted the dictator's achievements, read his public honors, and finally displayed his blood-stained toga to the assembled crowds. The emotional impact proved overwhelming. Ordinary citizens, many of them veterans who had served under the dictator or beneficiaries of his land distributions and social programs, abandoned the restraint that had characterized the initial public response. A spontaneous cremation began in the forum itself, with mourners throwing wooden objects, clothing, and even jewelry onto the growing pyre. The fire threatened to spread to nearby buildings as the impromptu funeral transformed into the first expression of the violent public backlash against the assassins. Mobs formed seeking vengeance, particularly targeting anyone with the misfortune of sharing a name with the conspirators. Cinna, the poet, mistaken for the praetor Cinna, who had participated in the assassination, was torn to pieces by the crowd, despite his protests of innocence and actual support for the dictator. The conspirators, recognizing the dangerous shift in public mood, accelerated their departure from Rome. Within days of the funeral, most had fled to their assigned provinces, abandoning the capital they claimed to have liberated. Brutus and Cassius, the conspiracy's most prominent leaders, withdrew to their estates outside Rome while negotiating for provincial assignments that would provide them with military resources. The compromise that eventually emerged, Syria for Cassius, Macedonia for Brutus, reflected both their weakened position and the Senate's desire to disperse potential flashpoints for conflict. The most unexpected development came with the arrival of the teenage Octavian in May. Despite warnings from his mother, Attila, about the dangers of claiming the dictator's legacy, he boldly entered Rome and publicly accepted his adoption. This decision placed him on a collision course with Antony, who had been spending the dictator's funds and acting as his political heir without anticipating this direct familial challenge. Their initial meeting revealed the tensions that would soon erupt into open conflict. Antony, the experienced general and consul in his 40s, treated the slender teenager with dismissive condescension. Octavian, displaying the political acumen that would eventually make him Rome's first emperor, responded with respectful firmness, requesting the funds from his adoptive father's estate to fulfill the bequests to the Roman people. Antony's refusal, claiming the money had been spent on state necessities, established the first open breach between the two Caesarians who should have been natural allies against the assassins. By summer, 3 power centers had emerged from the initial chaos. The conspirators regrouping in the eastern provinces, Antony leveraging his consulship and command of veteran legions, and young Octavian building support among both the dictator's former soldiers and, surprisingly, the Republican Senate. Cicero, initially dismissive of the boy, began to see Octavian as a useful counterweight to Antony, whom he considered the more immediate threat to Republican restoration. This triangular conflict would soon evolve in ways none could fully anticipate. The Republic the conspirators had hoped to restore through a single act of violence was instead fragmenting into competing power bases. The vacuum, created by removing the central figure who had held these forces in balance, would soon draw all parties into a new and even more destructive civil war. The dictator, whose living ambition the conspirators had feared, proved more dangerous in death than in life. His assassination, intended as the decisive act that would resolve Rome's political crisis, instead removed the only figure with sufficient authority to manage the Republic's contradictions. What followed would demonstrate that the conspirators had killed a man, but not the forces of history that had produced him, forces that would soon elevate his young heir beyond even his adoptive father's unprecedented power. The assassination designed to restore the Republic instead ignited 13 years of civil conflict more devastating than the struggle it sought to end. What the conspirators failed to understand was that the dictator had not created Rome's structural problems, but merely exploited them. His removal did nothing to address the underlying fault lines, the gulf between rich and poor, the divergent interests of Italy and the provinces, the professional army's loyalty to generals rather than the state, and the inadequacy of republican institutions for governing a vast empire. The conflict following the Ides of March unfolded in distinct phases, each reshaping Rome's political landscape. The initial period saw the formation of unlikely alliances as personalities and principles collided in kaleidoscopic recombination. Young Octavian, not yet 20 years old, demonstrated political instincts that belied his youth. Arriving in Italy with modest resources but powerful symbolic capital as the dictator's heir, he methodically built his position through calculated risk-taking. When Antony rejected his claims to his inheritance, he audaciously sold his own properties and borrowed heavily to fulfill his adoptive father's bequests to the people and soldiers. This gesture established him as the true heir in popular perception, while making veterans personally indebted to him. More surprisingly, he cultivated the Senate, particularly Cicero, who saw the youth as a useful counterweight to Antony's growing power. This alliance between the dictator's heir and Republican senators demonstrated how principle increasingly gave way to pragmatism in the fluid post-assassination environment. Cicero famously remarked that the young Caesar should be praised, honored, and eliminated, underestimating both Octavian's cunning and his patience. Antony, initially advantaged by his consulship and relationship with the dictator, overplayed his hand through arrogance and miscalculation. His attempt to take control of Cisalpine Gaul, currently governed by Decimus Brutus, one of the conspirators, prompted the Senate to declare him a public enemy. In the brief conflict that followed the Mutina campaign, Antony faced a remarkable coalition. The assassin Decimus Brutus defending his province, the dictator's heir Octavian commanding an army partially composed of his father's veterans, and the Senate supporting both against the man they now viewed as the primary threat to republican restoration. This alignment proved temporary. After Antony's defeat and retreat toward Transalpine Gaul, the Senate attempted to marginalize Octavian, having used him against the more immediate threat. The young heir responded by marching on Rome with 8 legions in August 43 BC, forcing his election as consul and outlawing the assassins. This naked use of military power against constitutional authority demonstrated how thoroughly the republican system had collapsed. A teenager with no previous office could now compel Rome's highest position through armed threat. The next phase of the conflict saw former enemies unite against the assassins. Octavian, recognizing the advantages of reconciliation with Antony, negotiated an alliance that included Lepidus, another Caesarian commander with substantial forces. This second triumvirate, unlike the informal arrangement of the dictator's time, was officially sanctioned as a 5-year commission for the restoration of the state, a legal fiction concealing raw power sharing among military strongmen. Their first act revealed the new regime's brutality. Needing funds and seeking to eliminate potential opposition, the triumvirs initiated proscriptions more systematic than even Sulla's notorious purges. Hundreds of senators and thousands of equites found their names on death lists, their property confiscated, and their lives forfeit. Most infamous was Cicero's inclusion, demanded by Antony in revenge for the orator's philippics against him. The great voice of Latin eloquence was murdered on December 7th, 43 BC, his head and hands displayed in the Forum, where he had delivered his greatest speeches. With Italy secured through terror and confiscation, the triumvirs turned east to confront the assassins. Brutus and Cassius had used their time effectively, raising 20 legions and substantial naval forces from eastern provinces and client kingdoms. The decisive confrontation came at Philippi in northern Greece in October 42 BC, where Republican forces faced the combined armies of Antony and Octavian. The battle unfolded in 2 engagements separated by weeks. In the first, Cassius's forces faced defeat against Antony's superior generalship. Believing the entire battle lost when only his wing had collapsed, Cassius committed suicide, a critical blow to the Republican cause. In the second engagement, Brutus initially held advantage, but lost cohesion as his troops broke discipline to plunder the enemy camp. Surrounded and facing inevitable defeat, Brutus fell on his sword, reportedly declaring that virtue was merely a word. With the deaths of Brutus and Cassius, the Republican cause lost its standard-bearers and moral center. Though resistance would continue under various leaders, including Sextus Pompey, son of Pompey the Great, who controlled Sicily and threatened Rome's grain supply, the principle of restoring traditional republican governance effectively died at Philippi. The question was no longer whether Rome would be ruled by strongmen, but which strongman would ultimately prevail. The triumvirate itself contained the seeds of its destruction. Following Philippi, the triumvirs divided the Roman world, Antony taking the wealthy east, Octavian the more turbulent west, and Lepidus the African provinces. This division reflected their relative positions, with Antony as senior partner, commanding greater military experience and prestige, while Octavian remained the untested youth whose illness had kept him from significant command during the decisive battle. The following years saw a gradual reversal of fortune between the 2 principal triumvirs. Octavian faced the difficult task of settling tens of thousands of veterans on Italian lands, displacing existing owners and creating widespread resentment. He also confronted military challenges from Sextus Pompey and Antony's ambitious wife Fulvia, who aligned with Octavian's discontented colleague Lucius Antonius to initiate the brief Perusine War. Octavian met these challenges with a combination of ruthlessness and strategic restraint. After defeating Lucius Antonius, he executed the local councillors of Perugia, but spared his higher-born opponents, demonstrating both determination and calculated clemency. He gradually marginalized Lepidus, eventually forcing his resignation from the triumvirate after accusing him of disloyalty. Most importantly, he began a comprehensive program to refashion his public image from the terroristic triumvirate, responsible for prescriptions, to the responsible restorer of Italian stability. Meanwhile, Antony's position deteriorated despite his control of the East's vast resources. His Parthian campaign, intended to emulate the dictator's planned expedition, ended in near disaster. More damaging was his increasingly public relationship with Cleopatra, whose previous liaison with the dictator now evolved into official alliance with Antony. Their public ceremony in Alexandria, the Donations of Alexandria, where Antony distributed Roman territories to Cleopatra's children, provided Octavian perfect material for a propaganda campaign portraying his rival as besotted with a foreign queen and alienating Rome's patrimony. The triumvirate officially expired at the end of 33 BC, setting the stage for final confrontation. Octavian, now controlling Rome itself, orchestrated a political campaign of remarkable effectiveness. When Antony's will was allegedly discovered and read publicly, quite possibly a fabrication, its supposed provisions for being buried in Alexandria rather than Rome cemented the image of a Roman-gone native, abandoning his heritage for foreign luxury. The conflict culminated at Actium in September 31 BC, where Octavian's forces under the brilliant Agrippa defeated the combined fleet of Antony and Cleopatra. The battle itself proved less decisive than its aftermath. Antony and Cleopatra escaped to Egypt, but found their support evaporating. When Octavian's legions reached Alexandria in the summer of 30 BC, both chose suicide rather than capture. Antony falling on his sword in Roman tradition, Cleopatra allegedly using a poisonous asp in a manner befitting an Egyptian pharaoh. With their deaths, the last significant opposition to Octavian's domination collapsed. The 13-year civil war that had begun with the assassination of the dictator concluded with his adoptive son holding power more absolute than the dictator himself had ever achieved. The republic, which the conspirators had killed him to preserve, lay in irretrievable ruin, destroyed not by a single man's ambition, but by structural contradictions that made traditional governance impossible for a Mediterranean-wide empire. Octavian, soon to be renamed Augustus and granted unprecedented powers under the fiction of restored republic, would create the imperial system that would govern the Roman world for 5 centuries. The Principate, as this system became known, maintained republican institutions as facade, while vesting real authority in a single ruler, precisely the arrangement the assassins had feared the dictator intended. Through bloodshed, prescription, and manipulation, more thoroughgoing than anything his adoptive father had attempted, the youth once dismissed as the boy completed the transformation his father had begun. The historical irony remains stark. The conspirators who killed the dictator to prevent monarchy instead created the conditions that made monarchy inevitable. In cutting down the man they feared would be king, they ensured the elevation of his son as emperor in all but name. The Republic did not survive its attempted restoration, a testament to how profoundly Rome had already transformed before the daggers struck on the Ides of March. The man who died at the foot of Pompey's statue achieved in death what even his ambition had not envisioned in life: immortality in human memory. Few historical figures have left such an indelible mark on Western civilization, penetrating language, law, literature, and political thought across millennia. His deification began formally in 42 BC when the Senate, under triumviral pressure, officially declared him Divus Julius, the divine Julius. A temple rose in the forum at the site of his cremation, where Romans offered sacrifices to the comet that had appeared during his funeral games, interpreted as his soul ascending to join the gods. This official cult, maintained throughout the imperial period, represented only the beginning of his posthumous elevation. His adopted son, now styled Augustus, brilliantly exploited and carefully cultivated the connection to his deified father. The title Divi Filius, Son of the Divine, appeared prominently on coins and monuments, lending religious sanction to what was essentially military rule. Augustus's creation of the Principate, a monarchy disguised as restored republic, built directly on precedents established during his father's dictatorship. The Julian reforms in provincial administration, military organization, and citizenship expansion formed the foundation of imperial governance that would sustain Roman power for centuries. Even more enduring than political structures were linguistic legacies. The seventh month became July in his honor, a designation that remains in use globally 2,000 years later. The title Caesar evolved from family name to imperial designation, then to the general concept of supreme ruler. As Kaiser in German and Tsar in Russian, it denoted sovereign authority into the 20th century. Few individuals in history have achieved the linguistic immortality of having their name become a common noun in multiple languages. His administrative innovations showed similar longevity. The Julian calendar, with its ingenious leap year system, governed Western timekeeping for 16 centuries, until Pope Gregory XIII's minor refinements created the Gregorian calendar still used today. His standardization of coinage established fiscal patterns that outlasted the empire itself. His comprehensive census provided the model for population accounting used by governments into the modern era. Roman literature preserved his memory through complex, often contradictory portraits. Virgil's Aeneid connected the Julian line directly to Rome's mythical founders, cementing divine ancestry. Lucan's Pharsalia presented a more ambiguous figure, brilliant but destructive, whose crossing of the Rubicon marked the death of liberty. Suetonius and Plutarch captured nuanced, often intimate details that humanized the legendary figure for later generations. Through their accounts, his famous last words, his epileptic seizures, and his vanity about his baldness preserved the man behind the monument. The Renaissance rediscovered these classical portraits, finding in the dictator a symbol for exploring questions of political legitimacy, individual greatness, and the tension between republicanism and effective governance. Dante placed Brutus and Cassius in the lowest circle of hell, alongside Judas Iscariot, betrayers of their benefactor, while Machiavelli cited the dictator's fall as evidence that princes must be feared rather than loved. These diverse interpretations reflected each era's preoccupations more than historical reality, yet kept his memory vibrant in European consciousness. No treatment proved more influential than Shakespeare's dramatic portrayal. His Julius Caesar transformed historical figures into archetypes: the ambitious ruler, the conflicted idealist Brutus, the manipulative Cassius, the opportunistic Antony. Though historically inaccurate in many details, Shakespeare's rendering captured essential truths about power, rhetoric, and human psychology that resonated across centuries. Lines like, "The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves," entered the cultural lexicon, ensuring even those who never studied Roman history absorbed some essence of the dictator's story. Modern interpretations continued this pattern of reinvention to serve contemporary concerns. 19th century historians like Theodore Mommsen portrayed him as a democratic reformer, battling aristocratic privilege, a view that aligned with liberal nationalism. 20th century dictators explicitly invoked his memory, with Mussolini's fascist ideology presenting itself as revival of Roman imperial glory. Post-war scholarship has increasingly emphasized his role in systematically undermining republican institutions while maintaining their outward forms, a cautionary tale for modern democracies. Film and television have created their own Caesar, from the dignified figure in Joseph L. Mankiewicz's 1953 adaptation of Shakespeare's play to more complex portrayals in HBO's Rome series. Each generation discovers him anew, finding aspects that resonate with contemporary concerns about power, leadership, and the fragility of democratic institutions. His conquest of Gaul, celebrated in his lifetime as his greatest achievement, left an equally complex legacy. While bringing devastating destruction to indigenous populations, it also integrated what would become France, Belgium, and parts of Switzerland into Mediterranean civilization, creating the foundation for modern European culture. The cities he founded, from London, Londinium, to Cologne, Colonia Agrippina, grew into metropolitan centers that still thrive today. Perhaps most profoundly, he represents the enduring tension between democratic governance and effective leadership. The republic he helped destroy had become dysfunctional, corrupt, and incapable of addressing Rome's pressing problems. His authoritarian solutions, while undermining traditional liberties, implemented necessary reforms the sclerotic Senate had neglected for generations. This dilemma, whether democratic systems can solve fundamental societal problems without surrendering to authoritarian figures, remains unresolved in political thought. What ultimately makes him immortal is this capacity to serve as mirror for each era's central questions about power, ambition, and governance. Unlike figures confined to their historical moment, he transcended time to become an archetype. The great man whose abilities raise fundamental questions about the proper limits of individual authority in a society that values freedom. As such, he remains not merely a historical figure, but a continuing presence in humanity's ongoing dialogue about the proper organization of political life. The final immortality lies not in monuments of stone, but in the realm of ideas. Every debate about emergency powers in a democracy, every discussion of military authority versus civilian control, every examination of the boundary between reform and revolution carries some echo of the questions raised by his extraordinary life and violent death. In this sense, he achieved precisely what he most desired: to be remembered not merely as a man, but as an inflection point in human history.